Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for being here tonight, and I want to thank you for your patience. We had such an impressive turnout, we needed to set up the overflow room next door, and that was the reason for the delay. This event is being live streamed into that space. I'm very pleased tonight to welcome two filmmakers who are very close to the Harvard Film Archive and to the vibrant film community that thrives here at Harvard. I'm speaking, of course, of Verena Paravel and Lucien Castaing-Taylor. Together, these two artists have explored and defined a radical, shape-shifting mode of nonfiction cinema that has its deeper roots in important traditions of ethnographic and anthropological film, but that also engages in an inspired and close dialogue with art cinema, both contemporary and historic. Tonight, we will watch the film that launched a collaboration that has given us 3 feature films. This film is Leviathan. We screened Canada last week, and we're screening Somniloquies on Sunday night. This is Paravel and Castaing-Taylor's still best-known work, and also still, I would say, the defining film of the Sensory Ethnography Lab, which was founded here at Harvard by Castaing-Taylor in 2006 to support the kind of research and innovative-based practice that they work within, and that seeks to steer documentary away from the logocentric axis that all too often defines its form and arguments. These filmmakers and the work that takes place at the Sensory Ethnography Lab instead embrace the sensorium as a vital and important means of understanding the experiential dimensions of place, the sounds, the textures, the vibrations, the emotions that destabilize and define our being in the world. Leviathan is a politically edged portrait of sorts of a fishing vessel and a critique of the industry that so devastatingly plunders the ocean. Leviathan is also a meditation on the sublime that follows Herman Melville and Joseph Mallard William Turner in locating and expanding the sublime as the rhapsodic and frightening encounter between the human and the oceanic. Like Dylan Thomas, Leviathan's description of the sea finds a way to give equal voice to the dancing fish and swooning gulls as the soaring waves and the clamor and tremble of the steel ship and the weary palaver of the fishermen locked in their perilous work. This is a film not just to be seen, but to be experienced on a big screen and with fully immersive sound. Leviathan and the films of the Sensory Ethnography Lab also embrace a raw lyricism of sound and image that recalls the longer tradition of lyrical documentaries that has its deeper roots here at Harvard in the films of past great filmmakers who taught here, and herein I mean also the Department of Visual and Environmental Studies. Speaking of Richard Rodgers, whose films will be screening actually here in late April, and Dominic Benechetti, who made a masterful film called Le Cousin Jules, but most of all Robert Gardner, who's the founder of the Harvard Film Archive, and whose masterpiece, Forest of Bliss, is a city symphony that offers Benares as a floating world, hovering between life and death, a world with a liquid temporality, defined by a liquid temporality of the river, counterpointed with the hustling rhythm of the city. Forest of Bliss takes its name from William Butler Yeats, and begins with a quote from the poet, just as Leviathan announces its own lyrical intentions and exploration of the oceanic imagination with a different kind of poem, a quote from the Bible. For these reasons, we are really thrilled to welcome one of America's most renowned poets and a member also of the Harvard faculty, Jorie Graham, who's going to offer a reading of her work, inspired in fact by the film we are about to see. Before welcoming Jorie Graham, I want to welcome our 2 filmmakers, but I should also say how really happy and actually thrilled, I am, that we are joined tonight as well by Robin Kelsey, who is the Dean of Arts and Humanities and has done many tremendous things to support arts and humanities here at this university that over its longer tradition has often cast artistic endeavors with a skeptical look of skepticism, but times are changing. He also teaches in the history of arts and architecture, where he focuses on photography and American art. Robin Kelsey will be the moderator and an interlocutor in the conversation which will follow after the screening. I also want to thank the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, and I want to thank its director, Dan Byers, and the assistant director, Daisy Nam. I also want to thank the director of the Woodbury Poetry Room, Christina Davis, who will say a few words of introduction to our distinguished guest, Jorie Graham. But first, please join me in welcoming Verena Paravel and Lucien Castaing-Taylor.
Thank you, Aidan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you also, Jorie and Robin. It's a film that we start. I think it was is it like 8 years ago? 2012. It was our first collaboration, and it's a film that we made while we were teaching sensory ethnography together. So it's an important film for us, of course, because we discover how to collaborate, and also it's a film that was made also because we both wanted to reconnect not only with nature, but also with our father. And we both have a completely different connection with the sea and our father. And it was a way for us to bring this back together. And we made this film for a year and a half, going at sea for maybe 6 or 7 voyage, I don't know, like trip, and we would know every time when we leave, and we didn't know when we would come back, and if we would come back in one piece. We'll talk about the film after, so I'll let you drone, maybe.
I would also thank you all so much for coming. It's a film that we're heartily sick of, and you might also be sick of it heartily or otherwise in an hour and a half. But the one extraordinarily exciting thing to us, which is something that we have no prior experience of whatsoever, and it almost feels like a miracle actually, is to be able to be here with Jorie Graham. And I just wanted to thank Christina Davis and from the Woodbury Room, and Dan Byers from the Carpenter Center, and of course Hayden Guest from the Harvard Film Archive for orchestrating this event. And when Jorie passed me a copy of Fast, I had read some of her poems before, but I was struck by, it may be a bit presumptuous to say, but struck by remarkable and completely unanticipated affinities and incredibly powerful reciprocal provocations between our work and hers. So I'm extremely excited to listen to Jorie tonight. Thank you all.
And our 2 gentlemen in the back in charge of the sound, Jorie has asked me to remind you to be particularly attentive to make sure that her voice is recorded. I'd like to also remind everybody, please turn off any cell phones, any electronic devices that you have. Please refrain from using them. And now please join me in welcoming, to introduce Jorie Graham, Christina Davis.
In Men in Dark Times, Hannah Arendt asserts that the earth is not humane just because it has humans in it, and does not become humane just because the human voice sounds in it or has, as Jorie Graham writes, this particular way of transmitting. And that what we might think of as some monolithic capital H humanity, with all due respect to the Dean of Arts and Humanities, is in fact not a static fact, but an ephemeral aggregate, an urgent synthesis that is summoned by emergency or crisis, or what we are capable of recognizing as crisis. And then Arendt says, once the fire is put out, until the fire next time. Once the fascists are defeated, until the fascists this time. Once the seas subside, until the tide next time. This composite humanity, this being numerous, disperses into singular selves again. The I resurrects its boundaries, fears, uncertainties, urges. Walls are restored, also nation states, borders, property. And for Arendt, this is not entirely a shipwreck of the singular, but rather we are crucially constituted and transformed by this co-motion of magnitude and bond, this summons of the other and this return to retention. Compared to the time in which Arendt was writing, we now find ourselves in a period of permanent newsbreak and relentless alert, in which our minds, which were already naturally, whatever that means, bombarded by 200,000 signals per second, are now compelled to process the constant banner of breaking news, breaking bad. And not just human news in the Anthropocene, but that of a larger interactive entirety, the endangered passage of persons, the endangered passage of beings. The task of onwardness at this time involves, among other things, our capacity or willingness to receive, acknowledge, navigate, and alternately be informed by and give form to this flood of sentience and summons, to perceive our membership in what Graham calls this whelm, the influx and efflux of it, the plural struggles we are immersed in, and that our bodies themselves cellularly, molecularly, tumorously are, and the changes we find ourselves among, confounded by, and contributory to. Given the magnitude of this task, who could possibly be, or choose to be, a teller for a time like this, counting it, accounting for it, and calling it to account? And not just time, but time, since we're also learning that we're in no same time as the trees, no same time as the plankton of the sea. Who could travel its synapses? Who could even try to trawl it? Who could mimic such a massing so that we can witness it from without while revealing to us portals within it, places of pause, of resistance, how not to be netted? Who could, in the face of so much commotion, momentum, extinction, change, mirror back to us the apprehension that is our fear, acknowledging there are so many ways to be afraid, while combining it with the more patient, accretionary, but no less urgent form of apprehension, which is perception? The etymology of emergency is, tell this to the White House, to bring to light, to surface or emerge, to help to be perceived. It's my belief that we are in the presence of just such a person who can, in the space-time of a single poem, enact a kind of accordion of consciousness that gathers and releases a seemingly incessant census of thoughts, beings, states, without growing mindset, without relying on a central, as she calls it, intelligence to adhere these entities or permanently unite these states. Except at times an eye, though that eye is no stable signpost in the sea, does not stand still in meaning, is less like a lighthouse and more like an air hole, signaling its and our shifting coordinates and constituencies. In so doing, Jorie Graham allows us to enter, much like the film tonight, an immersive, speculative, philosophic space where words, creatures, structures, systems, cells drift in mutual redefinition of one another. In writing this intro, I asked around for a word that would in some ways do for all things, for stones, seas, sand, gulls, minnows, meadows, what the word humanity does in its interchange with the human, summoning all beings and things from their silos, a chorusing of elements, and releasing them again. The Buddhist poet Anne Waldman offered the phrase composite reality to describe the magnitude of such animate and inanimate amongness, and the inimitable compositional reality that Jorie Graham's poetry achieves. In writing this intro, which is about to end, I also read how the filmmakers, due to the accidental capsize of the singular large lens they'd intended to use, opted for a series of tiny waterproof cameras that could be clipped or rested upon people, fish, objects, matter, thereby unmanning and multiplying the eyes in their remarkable Argus-like matrix. Placed side by side tonight in a kind of speculative coexistence, the works of tonight's poet and filmmakers remind us that it isn't necessarily art's responsibility to assuage us, or as Stanley Cavell writes, to purge us of pity or terror or fear or suffering, but to assist us in being capable of recognizing them in their many manifestations and being shown that there is still a place or no end of ways in which to act upon them. And what we get for this recognition isn't necessarily safety or sanity or satisfaction or landfall or a plaque that says humanity. What we get, as Jorie Graham writes, is to be changed. Please welcome her, Jorie Graham.
Good evening, and thank you to everyone for these elaborate installed introductions. I'm really looking forward to the movie and to the discussion afterwards. I think that I will read one poem, and it is a poem which seems, as was said at the beginning, very much inspired by this film. In fact, I had written it before I saw the film, and when it appeared in the LRB, my friend Alice Oswald, also a friend of the filmmakers, said, "Oh, you must go see the movie. It is so intimately related to the poem." I should say that the poem does involve deep water trawling. I'd seen some mediocre sort of documentary about it, and this movie is not about that. But I had recently been reading in detail about Snowden's revelations when I undertook this poem, and what interested me was how crude and basic the cables under the sea uniting the Northern American continent with the British Isles, these cables that could be cut that were sort of massively trawling the sea bottom with all of our data, trawling all of our information and gathering it up indiscriminately. And so the feeling of the relationship between those two kinds of networks set my thinking going. I would say that the idea of the indiscriminate network expands in many other directions, and maybe we can talk about it afterwards. I'm not sure that this film is as political as many of us try to make it. I think it might be up to a great deal more. One of the things that interested me in watching it was the feeling that, which animates most of the poems in this book, Fast, the attempt to, as Christina was alluding to about the cameras, the attempt to see from points of view that are not, and make us see from points of view that are not human. It doesn't mean that one can do that. It doesn't mean that the imagination can actually transcend its subjective position, but it does mean that the attempt to do so. When I asked Lucien how they did it, he described one person holding another person on the edge of a deck with a kind of a system, if I'm not wrong, of a kind of a 2x4 attached to another 2x4, and at the end of it, in the water, a kind of camera that could film underwater. So obviously it's still attached to the human position and still attached to the human predicament, still controlled by the human, but it is an attempt to access the points of view that are not of our species. I think that that's an incredibly important activity, and this poem attempts to do that. We could talk afterwards about why that might be so important, but one of the reasons that so many scientists ask artists at this point to make art in the attempt to make climate change feel real to people, and not sort of science fictive or alternately a set of statistical data that is terrifying but in fact paralyzing, is because the imagination, because information isn't the same as experience and knowledge, and the idea of sensory experience that leads you to feel what another species, another living part of the universe, a piece of the planet, what else is alive alongside you what it might feel like, helps you to perhaps feel that you might not want to participate in destroying it. And that's a very different, emotion leads to a kind of capacity for action, which is quite different from the desire for action that information leads to. So this project was about that. The poem I'm going to read is called Deep Water Trawling, and then, given how late it is, we'll be able to get to this movie and then to the questioning of the filmmakers. The blades like irises turning very fast to see you completely. Steel blue, then red where the cut occurs. The cut of you. They don't want to know you, they want to own you. No, not own. We all mean to live to the end. Am I human? We don't know that. Just because I have this way of transmitting, call it voice, a threat, communal actually. The pelagic midwater nets like walls closing round us, starting in the far distance where they look to us like distance, distance coming closer. Hear it, eliminating background. Is all foreground, you in it, the only ground, not even punishment, trawling nets, bycatch, poison, ghost fishing, the coil of the listening along the very bottom, the nets weighed down with ballast, raking the bottom looking for nothing, indiscriminate. There is nothing in particular you want. You just want. You just want to close the third dimension, to get something which is all, becomes all, once you are indiscriminate. Discards can reach 90% of the catch. Am I? The habitat crushed and flattened. Net of your listening and my speaking, we can no longer tell them apart. The atmosphere between us turbid. No place to hide. No place to rest. You need to rest. There is nature, it is the rest. What is not hunting is illustration. Not regulated, are you? Probing down to my greatest depths, 2,000 meters and more. Despite complete darkness that surrounds me, despite my being in my place under strong pressure, along with all my hundreds of species, detritus, in extreme conditions, deep water fish grow very slowly, so have long life expectancy, late reproductive age, are particularly thus vulnerable. It comes along the floor are particularly thus vulnerable. It comes along the floor over the underwater mountains, scraping the steep slopes. What is bycatch? Hitting the wrong target, the wrong size, not eaten, for which there is no market, banned, endangered, such as birds, sometimes just too much, no more space on the boat, millions of tons thrown back dead or wounded, the scars on the seabed, the mouth the size of a football field. And if there is no one, there is still ghost fishing, nets abandoned in the sea so they continue through the centuries to catch mammals, fish, shellfish. We die of exhaustion or suffocation. The synthetic materials last forever. Ask us something. How deep is the sea? You couldn't go down there. Pressure would crush you. Light disappears at 6,000 feet. Ask another question. Can you hear me? No. Who are you? I am. Did you ever kill a fish? I was once, but now I am human. I have imagination. I want to love. I have self-interest. Things are not me. Do you have another question? I am haunted, but by what? Human supremacy? The work of humiliation? The pungency of the pesticide? What else? The hammer that comes down on the head, knocks the eyes out. I was very lucky. The end of the world had already occurred. How long ago was that? I don't know. It is not a function of knowledge. It is in a special sense that the world ends. You have to keep living. You have to make it not become waiting. Nothing is disturbingly visible. Only the outside continues, but it continues. So you have to find the way to make the inside continue. Your entity is fragile. You are an object you own. At least you were given it to own. You have to figure out what ownership is. You thought you knew. You were wrong. It was wrong. There was wrongness in the mix. It turns out you are a first impression. Years go by. Imagine that. And there is still a speaker. There will always be a speaker. In the hypoxic zones is almost no more oxygen. Then there is no more oxygen for real. Picture that, says the speaker. Who are you? Where are you? Going down into the dead zones. Water, not water. The deeper you go, he says, the scarier it gets, because there's nothing there. There are no fish, no organisms alive, no life. So it's just us, dead zones, bigger than the Sahara, he says. The largest lifeless spaces this side of the moon, he says. She says. Who is this speaking to me? I am the upwelling. I am the disappearing. Hold on. Just a minute, please. Hold on. There is a call for you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Hayden and Dan for hosting this this amazing event. I'm co-teaching a course right now called The Future of Cultural Space, and teaching it in part because cultural spaces feel precious and endangered, and it just feels so good to be in a space as activated and alive as this one. So, Jorie, thanks for the poem, and Lucien and Verena, thanks for the amazing film. It takes a while to digest films normally, but I actually feel more digested by this film. Jorie, do you want to lead off? Do you have any questions for?
I mean, I had a question. I had a lot of questions before the movie, during the movie, and then ask questions. But that'd be great.
I think it's on.
Is it on like this? Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know what my limbs are anymore, so forgive me for a minute while I recompose into a human body. So eyes. Maybe we can. What I thought was extraordinary at the very end, in particular, I noticed it again. I mean, all the way through the film, the feeling of who's watching, whose position you're in, what the gaze is reinforced, of course, by all the focusing on the eyes of the creatures, the living eyes, the eyes of creatures that have been apprehended, that are still alive, the cut off heads that float with their eyes upside down, and then the eyes of the men. And you keep expecting something from those eyes. You realize it's not tears. You realize it's salt water, and the eyes of the men falling asleep. And at the very end, you keep telling us that we have to use our eyes for something, and that the film is obviously, because it's a film, it's all about using your eyes for some kind of an experience. At the end, you did a very interesting thing. You have all those credits. You actually have the thanks in a kind of basket that looks like it's all the sea creatures caught up in the net again, as if without any distinctions between them. And then, because we've used our eyes again for text, which has been sort of, and language, which has been purposely erased, except in those very sort of few moments when you try to understand the language, you come back with a piece of film which is all the birds again. And you make sure that the sounds and the watching of the birds lasts quite a long time after the credits, so that you wash us. I kept thinking it's a not a lave-bouche, but a lave-yeux. You have to wash your eyes out again and make sure that the text that had to be brought in with the sort of biblical the sense of all the Latin names of the fish and everything that was brought in as information had to be erased again, and your eyes had to do another thing that film asks you to do at the end. And I wondered about that. I was kind of surprised that at that moment, at the very end, your names came on. But there was clearly a decision made at the end there about what one is supposed to do with one's hearing, one's witnessing, one's looking, one's feeling through eyes, and then the problem of reading again and then taking it away. I mean, that's just a place to start, because there were so many moments when, obviously, as creatures, what we identified with, these heads cut off. I mean, you can't help but feel in this moment in history. I mean, at a certain moment, it feels like a Holocaust when you're watching it. It just feels like a night. And then there are other times when you start to feel like, well, the humans are imprisoned in it too, and the whole system is an imprisonment. And at no point do you make any of the humans anything other than every time you rise up to their face and we expect one kind of expression, we get another kind. We get an expression which is just as killed in some way, or as appalled or sad or numbed, or the man whose face running with tears, we suddenly realize that that is not an emotion that we're looking at. It's something post-emotion. So and the ways in which the entrapment of the creatures at a certain point becomes normal, and it's kind of this work going on, and we get used to it. The fact that we get used to it. I'm just wondering what kind of emotions in the end you were trying to elicit. Was this a film which was eco, and sort of at the beginning one feels that it is, and at a certain point something else happens to one. I'd love to know what others feel, but I sort of feel like something else happens to one which is beyond the politics of it. At the very end, it does feel like from the beginning and at the end, you have images that look like what we know to believe is the images of the creation of the universe and the destruction of the universe, right? At the very beginning, the way the light strikes the ocean and the sort of biblical structure of it that way. The end of time, but of time, or the end of time, like what kind of time is ending in the movie? And I'd love to ask you also about the long shots and how long these shots are. And you have this one signature shot that you make with your camera, which is you're looking and then and I think it's part of what the gaze is. You look and then you snap over and you come back. And you do it again and again. You're looking at a net or the coiling, let's say the coiling that's going on in the coils, and then you snap to look at the origin of them, and you go back and look at the coils, and then you make sure that you sort of snap at the origin and come back. It's a very unusual shot. And it has to do with, like, what am I looking at? And so that presence of what you ask us to look at and hear as opposed to understand, I'd love to hear you talk about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'll try. But you say a lot already, and then, I don't know how I can. There's so many things that you said, and I haven't seen the film in a long time too, and I had to flee in the middle of it, and then, so I always catch the beginning and the end, and so there's this missing piece in the middle that I can never watch. So I'll start, of course, to try to say something. But I was actually very surprised about your comment and question about the gaze, because for me it's a film, and I never thought of the film like that, because it's more of. I was never thinking of the gaze, like per se, but like more of something else, like something that comes from the body more than like something oculocentric. And I think it has to do with the way we end up surviving in this boat, because we always work with like no preconceived idea of what it's going to be, and we had no idea what we would encounter being at sea like that. But what happened is that we were shooting with like camera that were like regular camera, and then we lost most of them to the sea, and we ended up working with like very tiny camera that are usually used for extreme sport or a snuff movie. People like attaching those cameras to their body and then and glorifying their bearer by like showing exploits. And then the way we work with them, it's almost the opposite of what they have been used for. And So we realize by attaching, and then I'm thinking of like the shot when you say like we're looking at something and then we're turning and then we're watching again, but it's also a function of where we put the camera. And then we decided to. It's always a question that we have between us, where how can we share with our subject, with like rather than imposing like something, how can you really share the authorship with your subject? And then one of the idea was just like to give them some camera, and then so we attached those camera to their forehead. And then when we watched the image, we were very surprised because never it sound like it seems that to us that never before we have seen such an intimate representation of something, because it was like almost like a cephalic kind of point of view, because they were wearing the camera on their forehead, and it was extremely intimate, but in the same time it was also extremely objective, because they were laboring bodies, and they were not really aware of wearing this camera. And so there was no cinematographic intentionality, there was no directorial intention behind that. And for us, suddenly we realized that it conjugates like a great like a subjectivity and objectivity in the same time, that gave this not non-human gaze, but like something very different and very unusual. And I think we ended up, like, it was as if the body was writing something itself, and it was coming from these laboring bodies. And it was very unusual to see. And I think we kind of we pursued this idea, and also because our own position in the boat was one that was struggling with the element, with everything, and then so we kind of extending our. So it was never really about our own gaze, but it was like extension of our body. And so we were attaching the camera to us, we were attaching the camera to Paul, and in order also to try to capture everything that was around. But going back to those camera, and then that the usual their usual use, that was to, as I say, to glorify the bearers. In the way we try to use them is also on the contrary, rather than glorifying the human, I think we try to rescale the position of human, and to it's not to diminish them in a way that we wanted to crush them, but in a certain sense to try to reconnect them, like in a larger ecological, cosmological matrix that is beyond us. And I think it gives also this point of view that is unusual, because it's not completely human-centric. Yeah, and it gives sometimes the feeling that the elements, the sea, the sky, like are writing themselves, and so it's a point of view that is maybe a little bit unusual.
You had a camera in the water,
Yeah.
and then you had camera on people's foreheads, which makes those gestures, because those they look. But you said also, I think Lucien said, on their chest and on their arms.
Yeah.
And then where else on non-people did you put? Were you able to put the camera?
The thing is that, like, there is a lot of things that have been written about the film, and then most of the time people, they say, oh, they just throw a bunch of camera there, and there are actually people that they don't even know. Like, there was a critic who said that, oh, those Harvard people, they just throw some camera in the boat and they went to their warm office. But this was not the case. There is only 2 shots in the film that no, you say 4, but I'm not, okay, we'll see. But I'm not sure about that. I think it's only 2 shots that are actually where the camera is not related to, that is not embodied, like it's not related to a human body. I think this is a shot from the mast, and there's the shot that is right below the TV that they're always watching, and this is where Captain Brian is falling asleep, watching the TV, but also kind of watching us and actually morphing. It's like almost looking like an animal. There is also this, sometimes fish look like us and then we look like fish. But
it's one of the most abject representations of human subjectivity. It's really remarkable shot.
But otherwise, the camera is on a 16-inch, 16 foot. Sorry, with inches and feet. Not really good. Like a long pole. And then that we hold like that. So it's really hard to stay alive on a boat like this. So we basically have to one is filming, one is doing the sound, or one is filming and the other one is just make sure that the other doesn't fall off.
And the upside down birds. Where's the camera for the upside
So the camera is on the pole,
yeah,
and then we go from underwater and then up to the sky, and actually the camera with the speed of the boat just turn, and then this is why the seagulls are flying upside down. So there is no post-production, there is no special effect of any kind. This is actually the first generation of GoPro, which are the worst, and it's like now anybody has like camera 10 times better than that, but this is just the first generation. So it's like, and we, rather than like trying to make things better, we try to work with the accidental, with what is irritating, aggressive, even the sound, those cameras, they have this mono built-in microphone, and most of filmmakers would just like jettison all this really aggressive kind of machinic sound, but we decided to work with it.
The accidental choreography of the one fish head is really incredible. The way it ends up perched and silhouetted against the darkness, and then the way it slides off. It's quite amazing. Can I ask, though, about the editing process? Because I felt, especially this, I'd seen the film before, but this time, in the early parts of the film, I felt like the camera, for me, it was as if it was searching for something, but it didn't know what. There's a tremendous restlessness in the early sequences, and then it stabilizes only when it's looking at the other ship, and all the gulls, like lost souls, are kind of flying off to the side. And there's something about that moment, I don't know, Raft of the Medusa came to my mind or something. There's that kind of, there's the combination of the abject and the ambiguous relationship to what's distant. But anyway, there is a kind of rhythm to the way that this operates in the editing, and I wonder if you could just say something about what it's like to put in those shots, to put in the shot from above, and how you think about that as you stitch together the film. You have to do some work.
Yes, he always does that.
I'll be much more disappointing, A, because I have no memory, and B, because I think that most of our decisions, and perhaps most of yours, are largely unconscious, and I'm in a super poor position to begin to unravel them. If I talk about what was conscious, then I think not only are we not scratching the surface, but we're just being propagandistic. I really don't trust myself to talk about much of it, but especially about the editing. So if you ask what were our intentions about stitching certain scenes together, or about putting the scene from the top of the mast?
I'm not so much looking for kind of explicit intentions, like we did this to have this effect, but more just what the process is like. To the extent that you can describe what may feel like ultimately an intuitive process about the kind of rhythm that emerges. And rhythm isn't exactly the right word, but the kind of sequence.
Well, all I can remember is our debates, our discussions. And I think it was actually really interesting for me to listen to Dead Water Trawling read by you right before watching this, Deep, not Dead, and how assaultive and aggressive this film felt in comparison. I've read perhaps most of the poems in Fast out aloud to myself or anyone in my vicinity, somewhere between 10 and 20 times, and I feel compelled to read them much, much faster than you read them. And I don't know why. So Deep Water Trawling, with the combination of the M dashes and then these sort of barbed arrows at the end, propel me forwards in this really frenetic way. And I felt that the way, Jorie, you subvert semantics and syntactics and come up with these sort of, not haiku, but these sort of fragments of explosive images, was rendered in a completely different way to me than I'd ever experienced it before. And anyone who's ever been subject to my reading your poetry before. But the other thing I think was interesting to me was that I feel an anthropologist said of this film, a very eminent anthropologist said of this film, that it didn't, it gave us no sense of lived experience of the fisherman or the culture of the fisherman. It reduced fishermen to stereotypes. It doesn't even reduce them to stereotypes. They barely emerge into monotypes, never mind stereotypes, to be honest. But I feel that actually, in particular with Deep Water Trawling, that you're able to combine the human and the extra-human in a multiplicity of ways that we perhaps sought to semi-consciously while filming and slightly more consciously while editing. But I'm not sure that we failed. I'm not sure that we succeeded. I think we failed, but I'm not sure that matters necessarily. But it was oddly enough, in the lack of humanism in this film and the response to the lack of humanism in this film, that our second film after this, Cannibal, which is about a cannibal, we ended up making the most humanistic film of all. But I don't think we could combine the human and the non-human in the way that you've been able to.
Because if we can discuss Cannibal, which I haven't seen but know about, and I'm just curious because the third film, the new film you're making, also ventures inside the human body during surgery, opens up the body, and obviously Cannibal has some aspect to going into the human body, the cannibal activity. And I'm just curious, and when we get to the fish, I mean, I love what Robin asked, because the beginning is really like the beginning of Genesis, this movie. It's just light and darkness. You just don't know what is happening. You have no focal point. But the end is also, again, like that. It's as if it's the creation. And then, what comes out of the deep is this ship. And it coheres. And we wait to come to closer and closer contact with it. I think part of what I was asking is, we know something is providing what we're looking at, and so the idea of what to look at and what we're supposed to look at and what we're supposed to see awakens the sense of one's own eye doing this work while you're watching it. And then when you get, I think, that crucial moment of the lone fish head with the eye, you start looking at every fish eye. You start watching all of their expressions. You give a lot of different stages of the fish. You give them when they've just been surprised and they're still alive and they're just being sent out of the net. And we feel the feeling that you would have that maybe I could survive, that if you had been rounded up. I mean, you do feel that, I think. I don't think I'm importing it. They're the ones who are already, they're already out. The first ones we see are already almost dead. And we see them, then we see their lone heads. But we see this eye for a long time. And it's followed by the bird, another extraordinary scene of this trapped bird, and its eye, and its and I think that it awakens. I mean, you start to feel the weight of of what you're carrying, and of course you're in a film, so what your instrument is, in terms of what the film's asking you to use, besides your body and your heart and your soul, and it begins with this eye, and then we have, I think, the first real close-up that you focus on is what Robin was mentioning, which is that floating fish head that moves back and forth, and it turns and it looks at you this way and it looks at you that way, and it's like something out of Francis Bacon or something, but it's like, it's just staring at you, and you don't know what to make of that stare. You tell yourself the head's off, it's dead. The gaze isn't dead. and you find yourself going, it's alive, it's not alive, it's dead, it's not looking at me, I'm not looking at it, yeah, I'm looking at it, I don't know what to do. And that when it finally slides off the edge, you think you're free, and then you've got the captured, trapped bird. And each one of these times, every emotion you think you're supposed to feel about it, you guys subvert it within a few minutes, because you make us feel almost a kind of animal quality about the chains, the coils, the ways in which those nets that you use that are on either side that we experience so many times that seem like strange octopi that come up and come down. So there's almost no kind of life that, whether we call it animate or inanimate, the fish, the human, the fisherman. When the fisherman is sitting there in that extraordinary shot, I agree with Robin, we overhear, it's the only thing we hear clearly in the film, which is a narrative about sort of the disaster of the fishing industry and the end of the precariousness of their way of life. And that's a one piece of narrative that it is imported there. And
Did you say imported or
well,
important?
it's the only place where we wouldn't know how precarious this way of life was, and how the fishing grounds are being fished out, and how there's not, the catch wasn't sufficient except for the report that's going on overhead. And we watch him not even hear it anymore. We hear it. And so I just feel that there's something about the horror of it that we feel, and then at a certain point in the film, you get us to the point where we are beyond a moral emotion. And you get us into, and we start out with an aesthetic emotion, because the beginning is sort of like Turner. And then you get us into a moral emotion. And then you get us numb, or I'd love to hear other people's vocabulary for it. And then you get us to a new level, what you would call, I think, body acceptance about creation and destruction. By the time we get to the end, and it seems like it's the end of the industry, the end of these men's lives, the end of the it feels like the chains are okay with it, the ocean is okay with it, the birds, there's no right or wrong any longer. You managed to get past that. And I found that very disturbing the second time, and very brilliant. The first time I was upset. The second time I was upset, and then something else afterwards. I wouldn't want to put words to it. I could, but it's as if there's a metaphysics that you put us into afterwards, which is of acceptance of a certain kind about what destruction and creation are, that justifies calling it Leviathan, and ecologically, politically, is very interesting. It's very confusing. You bewilder our compass, which we think is really operating clearly when we're having all these emotions in the center of the film. And then you go beyond that. I'd be very curious what other people felt by the end, whether the sense of outrage and grief and appall, and on behalf of the men, on behalf of whether at the end there's some other altogether emotion that you've brought us to. Does that make sense? Do people, I was curious if people...
Yeah, let's throw it open, unless do you want to respond in any way?
I would just say it makes so much more sense than I can make. But it makes sense that gels with my own sentiments. In terms of my memories of how we fabricated this after the fact, after we had stopped going out, we went out for about 1.5 years, and then I don't think we started editing till we'd come back after the 6th voyage from memory. But I do remember having these debates about really schematic pseudo-academic debates, like, I don't want to blame myself too much, but I remember saying, do we start off in the domain of, to be glib about it, do we start off in the domain of nature and end up in the domain of culture, something more recognizably human, or do we start off in the domain, which is the traditional province of documentary, of the humanistic, and end up in something much more wild and undomesticated that, for want of a better word, we still insist or have no other word for than nature. But in fact, not through design or even through dialogue, we ended up doing, or the film ended up being something quite, doesn't start off in either domain and it doesn't end in either domain. It begins perhaps in a sphere that appears to be searching. I still think it searches and fails to find throughout, but it's not obviously directional. There's no obvious teleology. There's no obvious narrative.
I just meant the
beginning.
restlessness early on. Yeah, I agree with you. It's not that you find what you're looking for. But
you could be in geologic time at the beginning. It's as if it's sort of the way light strikes the early oceans of the world before anything has been created, that we would, so there really is that restlessness, but also that feeling that that nature itself is restless, or purposelessness, or full of purpose. But it confuses all of the categories.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think the way that flesh and metal and plastic and water just continually are being metabolized in the film in this way that feels violent, in which you have this affective response, but by the end, somehow you've moved to some other place vis-a-vis that
it could be that
interlanguage.
you've moved to you've accepted a kind of apocalypse, and you've moved to a post-human place, so that you are another entity. I mean, I felt as much, after a while, as much compassion for ropes as I did for human. I mean, all of it seemed, matter itself seemed like a mystery, and that's why I felt that this creation from nothing of matter at the beginning, this emergence that Robin was describing, and at the end, the way it disappears again. You have the huge explosion at the end, as if it's sort of like something Antonioni would have dreamt of, which is the disappearance of everything. At the end, it's really a total act of sound. The sound and the visuals are an act of destruction of all the visible. The visible turns back into sort of Turner, and then it disappears. And then words appear. That's why I thought it was so interesting that words appeared. They seemed like the strangest thing. You had this type that looked biblical or Lutheran or something, and then words. I mean, I thought, oh my God, I'd forgotten that words existed, because words hadn't really been uttered in the film. And then you knew to give us a good few minutes of post-word activity so that we went back to what we had. And it was the strange sort of the birds disappearing to the right. I thought the first time a human came in, they're completely cloaked in red and shiny, right? So sort of the blood already is covering the human with the blue hand just in the corner pointing. It was just phenomenal. It was all, everything was flesh or meat or devourable, or, I think it's a very interesting film in terms of eco-politics, because, it makes a lot of assumptions through the middle of it, that, where we know how we feel about this. We know what it is to be fishing out the fishing gun. We know what it is to, at this point, to be destroying the oceans. Just the sound in the water, what we know about sonar and what it does to sea creatures. It's just listening. Every time you go underwater, the sound underwater is appalling, and you come above water and the sound underwater disappears. So all of the feeling of the destruction is very great. And then I'm not sure, I'd love to know whether people at the end felt a kind of lifting away from all of the normal human emotions, as if one was oneself post the human emotions that ecological narratives usually put one in. I found that.
But did you get to a Pacific place, which I didn't mean that pun because we're talking about the Atlantic, but really a kind of peaceful post-human place? No, right? I mean, it's still...
No, not peaceful, just that all wires were crossed. Everything was shorted out. And so I got to a place where maybe I was in the place that nature puts you in, which is, your desire to save or create, being privileged over destruction, and the hierarchy has been bouleversé so many times that you no longer know where to put in the thread and where to put in the needle. I mean, you just don't know morally. I mean,
No.
I was confused the second time through by what I was supposed to feel at the end, but not so confused that I couldn't feel it. I just don't know how to name it.
So let's throw it open for other questions that people may have. There's a question right here.
Yeah, I guess I empathize a lot. I felt like I was they're recording. I can empathize a lot. I felt like I was moved in a bunch of different ways, and at the end I wanted to know if there was a net movement in a certain direction, or if I had just been sort of expanded in all of those directions. And if we don't want to talk about or don't feel like you can retrospectively say, like, what the decisions were on the cutting room floor, or like in terms of the editing process, like if there was any sort of moral there. Then I guess maybe a different question would be, why are you two documentarians, or are you artists? Like why was it important to create this, and why was it important to share it, and like why do you do what you do, even if it's not specifically this film? Yeah.
Well, what is the sensory ethnic? Could you explain what that lab is? That's part of. I mean, I don't want to get in the way of the question. But.
Yes, that's doable. But I think your question's kind of unanswerable. Although I like your use of the word net. Is there a net movement in any direction? Which I can't answer. Perhaps you can answer about why we do what we do. I don't know. I don't think any of us know why we do what we do in any useful or even comedic way. The sensory ethnography lab we set up, I have no sense of time, a decade ago, and it's incredibly modest lab that exists in large part thanks to Robin's support. But it had modest ambitions, but I suppose its ambition was that it was set up at the intersection between anthropology, which is the only subject that we have any formal training in, documentary and art. And there was a sense that anthropology is, cultural, social anthropology is desperate to transcribe all. First of all, it has to textualize everything, has to linguify it, has to turn it into not just language, but into propositional academic prose. But it has to reduce everything to meaning, cultural meaning. And most forms of being are not even transposable into meaning, or meaning that can be verbalized in any sense. So it was an effort to sort of grapple with or represent or evoke the magnitude of reality, and especially the aspects of reality that are irreducible to what would ordinarily be considered to be meaning. And then there was also the ambition, which still continues to this day, to be engaged with what we call the real, or with reality, but again not to address it in the way that has been hallowed by most forms of documentary, which are perhaps a little bit, not insipid, but a little bit hidebound and a little bit beholden to conventional ways of, often journalistic, despite themselves, often very journalistic, expository ways of engaging with the real, that privilege ex post facto spoken commentary rather than people's lived experience. And then, the hope was also, to the extent there's any ambition to engage with contemporary art, was to also to bring back a sort of a huge, explosive kind of punctum of reality into contemporary art, and see what the friction between these three different domains might result in. But yeah.
I have a question. I know when you did Sweetgrass, you shared the film with the subjects you filmed. Did you do that with Leviathan? Did you show the film to the... And what was the response of the subjects to seeing the film?
The human subjects, or the pelagic subjects?
Well, if you want to tell us what the fish heads thought, that would also be
thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank
I can speak with complete confidence on for the next 3 hours, yeah.
No, we did, but I think they were always the first to see the film. I think they saw the film, but they could not see it in a condition like today. So they saw the film in the very television that Brian is falling asleep.
Well, first of all, they saw our previous films, or some of them,
But they,
on the boat without it. They saw Sweetgrass, actually, I think, first.
They saw also foreign parts.
They saw Sweetgrass first, and they said, surely we're not as boring as those sheep. No, they said, surely even we cannot, you can't make as bad film about us as you did about the sheep. And they enjoyed a film that
because there's a car in it, like
there were cars
pieces of
called foreign
cars,
parts.
and so they kind of liked it.
And then also, because we were filming onto these tiny cameras which contemporary cameras which record onto solid state devices, onto SD cards and so on, we were downloading them in the cabins, and they would watch us come and watch rushes, as they're called, sometimes, and get variously bored at different points. But with a lot of curiosity, and they were often intrigued by that. And then we were hoping that they would be able, when the film was finished, that they would be able to come to festivals or see it in public with us. And I don't think that's ever happened. So they saw it initially on the boat, and then they've seen it at their homes. I remember the
Lotus Century, I think.
No, but they each have about 50 or 100 DVDs of it. Anyway, but the captain, I remember the captain's response. Well, and the captain is the man who falls asleep in front of the deadliest catch, which in terms of editing is worth mentioning, because in the first mix for the first screenings before it came out in cinemas around the world, we deliberately turned the volume down because we thought that it would be too risible, that it would be too obviously allegorical, that it would appear ridiculous and therefore would appear to be our fictive imposition masquerading as something documentary. But it was actually all recorded in sync. And in any case, after the...
We needed the ads between anyway.
The ads for colon flow and everything.
Because they were all about digesting.
Yes, exactly.
You couldn't have faked that. I mean, that was... But what was
the captain's response was, having been incredibly shy and retiring, he's also the guy with the tattoo, and he was almost impossible to get to be on camera. He said, I think the seagulls, I think the great shearwaters are the hero of this film, not me. And he had spent the previous 9 months, 12 months, urging us to hurry up and finish the film, because even though now there's been a huge generational shift, whereas there have been a series of generations where people have been very proud of being out at sea for all the reasons we can imagine, now there's a shame attached to it because they feel they've been so criminalized by the transformations of ecological consciousness and also the economy of industrial fishing. And he felt that even though he had regaled his loved ones with stories about being out at sea, and even though when he had been back in port in New Bedford or in Gloucester, his family had been there, his father in particular, who was sick, was dying, had no idea phenomenologically what it was like to be out there. And I remember him just begging us, saying, can you just hurry up and finish this, show it, so I can show it to my dad before he dies.
There's something amazing about, for the experience of watching it, of the feeling of surfaces, and that surfaces are broken into, and when surfaces are broken into, obviously you penetrate, you kill, you invent. I mean, everything, creation is about breaking into the surface. And it's one of the great surfaces is the discovery of the tattoos and of the skin, and how so many different tattoos emerge, as if they too are the creaturely feeling of the surface of the men, because the surface of the fish is also so glimmering and beautiful, and we cut into the surface of the fish, and the surface of the water is something that you constantly break into. And the film begins with, really looks like it's an abstract beauty at the beginning, this idea that the surface of the film is, there is a question that one asks oneself, and I think gets passed in the film, which is, this film is so aestheticized. It's so making so incredibly beautiful things that we have so many problems that obviously these people feel criminalized, but there's a whole conversation about that too. And yet you manage to, and the surfaces of everything are gleaming. Sometimes it almost seems like you must have put Vaseline on the men because their lips are shiny. Everything is shiny. Everything is filled with seawater. You feel brine everywhere. You feel this sort of, the feeling, the presence of a Dionysian world completely sort of coming alive all the time. And the surface is everywhere, constantly on the verge of exploding, really, with color, with texture. And then they do. And then they recompose. And the most deadly surface is obviously you cut into the flesh and you kill. And I was amazed at the fact that the beauty of it did not overwhelm the truthfulness of it. That the beauty of the film is the horror of it is hand in hand with the beauty of it. And many people would have argued, I really don't want you to make this to aestheticize it to this degree. And you get past that. But you linger in it for a long time. You have passages which are just purely lyrical, descriptions. The dying fish as they swim around, as they move around, you stay with them. I think a camera right down very low in among them practically for a long time, until from the feeling of these herded creatures that are dying, you can see their gills, you can feel them suffocating, you feel the suffocate. At a certain point, you stay with it so long, and the way you use time in the movie, you make us get used to it until our horror has to dissipate into curiosity, and then from curiosity into a sort of a sense of the ultimate beauty of the carnage, and then some other level of morality, which I keep wondering, how to name. I'm hesitant to do so, but there is a different emotion that would not come about if you didn't stay as long as you did with each thing that you stay with. I mean, the amount of time you follow those ropes is almost crazy, okay? And yet, going back and forth between them, but there's something about that you want us to feel, which is not the obvious thing that we first feel, but you make us go through stages of emotion. I think the most obvious one that one could follow is the dead creatures, the dying, the dead, the entrapment, the feeling of them, and how we move towards, the kind of... It's very difficult for me as a person who feels like they're an environmentalist to say that you get to a point where we accept some of this destruction as a form of the depth of life that we have to really... I find that very interesting. I don't know if other people had that experience of becoming morally baffled and then released not into wonder or not into acceptance or not into any of the things, but released into a negative capability, if you want to call it, something where you allow yourself, as Keats says, negative capability without irritable reaching after fact and reason. I mean, this is feeling of acceptance of a negative state, which is which still feels like it has morality, has spirituality, it has aesthetics, it has everything, but it doesn't have a vector in it that is that allows you to proceed politically, I guess is what I would say, in your emotion. Does that... Other people feel like... 'cause I think that
resonates a lot with me, but I'd love to get a couple of more questions from the audience. Yeah, please.
I have a question about the kind of the technicalities of shooting. If you can recall, I know it's from a long time ago, but what were some of your biggest struggles in terms of shooting and in terms of be able to adjust to that kind of lifestyle? And how long did you stay on that boat each time? Yeah.
The shooting and the lifestyle.
And how long did you stay on the boat?
So we went out at sea for so the whole shooting was over the course of 1 year and a half or 2 years, and we went out at sea for 6 fishing expedition. And you never really know how long you're going to stay at sea. So it can go from 10 days to 3 weeks every time. I think the longest we stayed was a little bit over 3 weeks. And I think the shortest was like 8 to 10 days. And we shot during the winter and we started actually in March, and the first trip was 7 days of storm, basically. So I guess if we add up all the days, it was something like 3 months at sea. And if I understand your question, was how did we film and live in this boat, right? No, or how? And what were some struggles? It's a long story, but so basically, one of the way we usually do is we try to live exactly the same. We try, of course we don't succeed in doing so, but we try to learn, and so we learn very rapidly that even working really night and day, we would never ever be able to, even in a year or two, we could never be really fishermen. We were really bad at like shocking scallops, so we were cooking, we were cleaning, we were trying to do exactly the same thing as they were doing. So we would be on their exact shift. So we would sleep every 20 hours. We would sleep for 2 or 3 hours. And so to the point that I guess this beauty and this horror comes also for the fact that after a while, everything, the up and the down, the sea and the sky, and then the day and the night are start to melt together, and then you don't really understand where you are. And so, but we were basically working, and every time there was hauling back, we would be on the deck. So you have a siren, and then you have like 3 minutes to be on the deck. So we would. I think I had a different treatment because it's like a bad luck to be a woman on the boat, and so I think I had a different relationship with them. Where I think I had to prove a little bit more that I was a tough person, and we also had different relationship to the being seasick, and so Lucien was really sick, and sorry to say that publicly, but so for the first 72 hours, every time I was kind of all by myself, and doing so, which was also good to be accepted, and to be accepted, I think you have to show that you can survive, and then through days and night and not sleeping and always filming, and so we would shoot all the time, as much as possible all the time, and spend also hours and hours. So we never do interview, but we discuss a lot. We try to learn. We try to understand. We try to to exhaust something. And it's a research that it's always like a film. It's always like a process of searching all the time. We never have an idea of how the form will be, how the film will be, and every time we have an idea, or a preconception of anything, we try to resist it, or we try to divorce from it at some point. And every single idea we had about this film, we ended up turning our back to. We wanted to make a film about the sea, about humanity's relationship to the ocean, but then we wanted to make this film where we would never see the sea. So for 6 or 7 months, we only filmed on land, and we didn't want to go at sea. So we wanted to make the film on the dock, and then suddenly this captain inviting us, and then the experience at sea was so overwhelming, violent, completely, the magnitude of it was just that we never see the land actually on this film. And so I don't know if I know how to answer your question, but just for me, I think it's different for both of us, but for me the only way to survive in this condition was to work and work and work until I dropped dead. So I usually ended up in hospital every time we would go back on land. Lucien would drive me to the hospital, and then again on the boat, and then again in the hospital. It was just very physically, it was complicated, emotionally too, because it's a word of extreme violence, with. Where we have to survive, and then we have to survive against the element, but against each other and with each other, complicated, without going into detail. But I don't know how you would describe our filming.
That was long enough. I'll just add that industrial fishing has the highest mortality rate of any profession, and has had in recent decades. It would be second to mining, except for the fact that fishermen kill each other with much more frequency than miners. So if you discount self-inflicted injuries and deaths, it wouldn't be the highest mortality rate. But it is an extremely psychotic, intense universe out there at sea. And obviously, for centuries, if not for millennia, the sea and fishing has attracted people who have a hard time surviving under the law on land in what we normally call society. So it attracts people who into this extraordinary hotbed of this microcosm who have a hard time usually existing in some kind of social situation. There were some amazing things that I remember people saying. Do you remember Robbie when he was saying he was in heaven out there, in utter heaven, during the scallop season when they're working 2 10-hour shifts in any 24-hour period, having carpal tunnel syndrome after 5 years, engaged in this utterly repetitive, grueling, devastating form of labor, and he called it heaven. He called it freedom, just pure freedom. I remember that word.
Well, you have that couple, the 2 times that we linger on 2 men as they're lowering those red buckets, and they have an almost comical relationship. You know, it has the human comedy kind of feel to it, and the different faces that emerge. But when you go up close to that man, the one who's at the captain's, his eyes, and when we reach his eyes, because we crawl up to the eyes, and by now we're used to looking at creatures with eyes, okay? So we're waiting to see what the eyes tell us, because you can't tell much about the fish until you get to the eyes every time that you look at it. And then you know how, and then the strange thing about the fish in this film, which I think is a metaphor, is that their eyes look alive, the same when they're alive or dead, on film at least, so that you can't tell what the transition is between life and death. And you're looking for it in the humans as a result, and in yourself, and in the planet, and everything, that transition is constantly being worked. But the way you go up his body, and then you get to these eyes, they are so archaic and sad, and they're like out of Moby Dick or something, but they're just completely these incredibly wrinkled. His gaze is nothing that one expected. At least I don't know about anybody else, but I expected him to be tough, or I expected him to be seasoned, or whatever the cliches are about someone who's driving the boat. And instead, the depth of understanding and of sadness and of complete acceptance that is in his face, and you stay on him for many, many minutes. And obviously there's that question, what is the stuff coming down his face? It's not tears, then it's brine, then it's salt, then it's sweat. We don't know what it is. But I don't know how you felt about his gaze, but his gaze was the tone of the movie. I mean, the emotion that we have at the end, that I was looking for, how to name it, what I think is counterproductive. I think it's in his eyes. There's a level of seeing the archaic past, the geologic past, and the ancient future, if you want to think of it that way. The sort of he is the old man of the sea in some essential way, in the way that we've always thought of it. He has the wisdom, and he looks like a walrus. He looks like a lot of other things too. He's just a total creature, but with an emotion, which is this tone. And you stay on him so long, that tone of that eye gaze. I was astonished by the emotion, and I'd never seen it. It's as if I'd never seen it before, because sad is the wrong word. Yeats says their ancient glittering eyes are gay at the end of the poem Lapis Lazuli. This ancient acceptance that was just a revelation for me emotionally.
So to knit together some of the things that have been said, we've talked about the gaze a lot, and that the eyes of the living and the dead, of the fish looking the same. And it's, in a way, it's a very neo-Lacanian film. I mean, it really, if you read Lacan on the gaze, I know we don't cite Lacan anymore like he's some quasi-sacred author and whatever. There's no particular authority attached anymore, which in a sense is very freeing, I think. But if you read Lacan on the gaze, it's about fishing, right? His whole anecdote when he writes about the gaze is he goes to Brittany, and it's a kind of spoof on Hemingway. Like, he's going to go off as a young man, and he's going to go out on the sea, and that's when the fisher people that he's with make the joke about the sardine can. Do you see it? It doesn't see you. Right. But then he realizes that it is looking at him, and you have that is like a ginger ale can that's crushed in there.
Oh my God!
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that ginger ale can was so good. Like, it has an eye too.
But I think, but for me, and this gets back to something that you were saying, Jorie, is that for Lacan, the visual field is a social field in which we are always out of place. And but in this film, the visual field is this violent metabolic field in which we are captivated and sort of churned up. in this way. And I'm all churned up. Let's take one more. We'll take one more question, and then we'll break.
So I actually want to get away from the gaze and the visual field and talk about the auditory experience that this movie was.
Yeah,
'Cause
good.
For me,
Very
that
good,
was
yes.
an unbelievable thing. I feel like I've never heard anything like that before. I'm just curious, you guys filmed with GoPro, so there's not a lot of recording going on there as far as I know. But then you also credited a sound editor or something like that. What was the process as far as both recording and then editing after the fact in terms of bringing out these different crazy sounds of the ocean and the machinery and the animals? When they were shucking those shellfish, I don't know what they're called, that was just such a nice rhythmic beat to it. Or when the bird was trying to escape or whatever it was doing, there was that repetitive tapping that to me was more striking than the bird itself. I just want to get a sense for whether you guys were, how much you were thinking about that and whether that was a part of the final product intentionally or if it kind of spun out.
And how was it working with Ernst, right? Who did that's a great question.
I'll be very short. So there were 3 sources of sound. One were the extreme sports cameras, the GoPros, which, as you said, had a poor quality mono microphone. They were also encased in an impermeable plastic housing, which further attenuated both the volume and the quality of the frequency spectrum that it could record. And also because they were on these 2x going under and over water, the changes in pressure was such that it resulted in a lot of sonic acoustic artifacts that any real filmmaker would have got rid of in the name of naturalism of some kind. But on the contrary, working with Ernst Carroll, who also teaches and works in the sensory ethnography lab, isolated and then enhanced those particular frequencies once we could identify them. And we were attracted to them and made anxious and distressed by them in equal measure, I think, because they simultaneously sounded in some fashion to us, this is how I remember it, as incredibly machinic and cyborgian and grating and almost organic, as if they were being waterboarded or gasping for breath when they came up and so on. So hence utterly organic. So there were those sounds from the mono microphones of the GoPros. Then we recorded with a stereo microphone that we could name if anyone was so interested. But unfortunately, with such poor sound recorders, it was all massively over-modulating. But nonetheless, quite a lot of that was recuperated and added. That was wild sound that we recorded on the boat that ended up in it. And then we also equally, if not more unsuccessfully, put wireless radio lavalier microphones on various objects and animate and inanimate objects, mostly the fishermen.
That's great.
And but unfortunately, the sound of the engines and the sea was so overwhelming. We initially thought we're not as phobic about dialogue and any of the normal manifestations of human subjectivity as you might imagine. We initially were interested in capturing dialogue, but it was largely a vain endeavor. There are 4 or 5 snippets of dialogue that are semi-intelligible. If you're a Maino or if you're a fisherman, you'll understand it, but most of us won't. So most of the wireless lavalier sound was jettisoned. We were also interested in using wireless lavalier microphones, as we had done in some of our earlier films, to try to encapsulate the sounds of the fish in their death throes. It was a kind of an absurd endeavor to sort of try to evoke the subjectivity of fish as they were dying. In any case, we combined all these sounds, and then Ernst Carroll with us, but I think largely without us, almost for the most, we weren't present for the most of the time. We talked, we met once a day over the course of about a month, but then he would mix and come up with a sound design with 5 channels of sound and 1 subwoofer. And then we also, and that was, he is the sort of post-Cagean minimalist musique concrète par excellence. And we're both, I'm tone deaf, and before we gave it to Ernst, it was just like this hardcore, unremitting grunge rock thing that was, it's still unlistenable to, but it was really unlistenable to them. And he made it incredibly modulated and much more subtle, perhaps a little bit too subtle for my ears. And then we worked with Ernst, and we worked with a sound designer called Jacob Rybikoff, who we sort of thought, it's obviously a non-fiction work, but why is it that fiction filmmakers have a monopoly of working with sound in a way that's considered to be unacceptable in non-fiction? So a lot of the panning sounds and so on which are all synchronous, were done with Jacob Ribicoff, with Ernst as well, but they were working with someone in addition to Ernst.
But one of the great things about the sound, I think that's such a great question, is a lot of the time, because we don't know where we are or what's happening just out of view, beyond the gaze, we rely on the sound to tell us what they're doing. Like many of the things are, we can hear the shucking, but we can't see it. So, we learn to read sound for actual narrative activity. And I think the sound I think it's a great place to go to because it awakened. I think the sonic element for creatures is what you start to feel, because as a creature, you start using your sonic element to reconnoiter, to figure out what's happening, to know whether it's danger, whether it's life or death. I mean, there are sounds that the fish, we have the illusion that we can hear them, even if you didn't capture them. A lot of it is the sound also, the terrifying sound of the swishing water as it's carrying them back and forth, because we feel it's the boat, but there's something about fate that is in that water. I mean, it reminded me of the opening shots of Roma, and I thought how much better the way the water was washing back and forth here was in that incredible, scene where there are many different scenes where they are not in the sea anymore. They're in a new sea, which is a sea made of capture, and in that sea made of capture, they're now being moved around as opposed to their having the agency to do the moving. But there's still like schools of fish being moved in death in another sea, which is on the boat, and it just makes you think about I find I know I don't mean to allegorize the movie, but I did find myself thinking about the concertina wire and the trapped people in our borders and the people crossing the Mediterranean. And one of the things that I thought about the first time a poem I didn't have time to read tonight, but that I wrote is that the Mediterranean is, if you were going to do that ocean right now, it has so many dead people because of the migrations, which are partly the entrapment and the netting of people through climate change, civil war, drought, and hostile conditions that force them into these nets of migratory patterns that they can't get out of, that are going to kill them. The bottom of the Mediterranean is so full of dead people that the fish catch in the Mediterranean right now, in that part is so huge. The fish are so big, and there's so many, that there are many Italians that won't eat the fish because they say, they're eating flesh. They're eating human flesh. That's why the fish catch is so enormous. And I thought of it the first time I saw this too. But it's an amazing thing what the bottom of our oceans bring back up as fish, and then we bring them on board. And I was thinking of the Lacan too, but I didn't want to be pretentious.
Yeah. You have to leave that to an administrator. Yeah.
Okay.
And speaking of administrators, no, please,
Can I
Verena.
say something?
Yeah.
Because, like what you just said, Jorie, about the Mediterranean, actually this film, Leviathan, is part of a larger project about our relationship to the ocean. And so it's the original name of the project is called Can You Draw Out Leviathan with a Hook? And so there is 4 parts, and Leviathan is just one part of this bigger project about the sea. And one of the I'm mentioning that because you mentioned the Mediterranean in your poem, and when we were editing the film, several times, when you edit, you stop like randomly, and several times we saw in our image that froze like that on the screen some apparition, some presence, and that we immediately called spirit. And rather than goes with the obvious, easy explanation that it was just digital artifact, we decided to take extremely seriously those apparitions. And when the film was done, we went back to the first frame of the film, and during months day after day, we went through the 130,000 frame that constitute the whole film, and we extracted all the spirits. And the image that we took out from the film really resemble warrior, migrant, sea creature, monster.
Yeah,
so it goes back to, so we just decided to take them seriously, because it's also ocean. It like goes back to our prehistory and our future and maybe post-history, and so we were extremely serious about them. And I think, I don't know if you feel it in the film, but for us, it's when you're talking about creation and all that, I think this is something that we had in mind when we were doing this film and this research. And for me, it's also something that has to deal with the womb. I mean, you are talking about the sound. There is some sound that are also like sounds intra-uterine. I don't know how to say that
That's
in
what
your language.
Uterine sound.
Yeah, I think you should read the
No.
poem.
No.
Okay.
Enough. We've all. This is phenomenal. It must be said that one could see. I know they are peculiar to a certain landscape and culture, but these could have been Phoenicians. These could have been people. I mean, you really felt that this has been going on forever. This is our relationship to the sea. The fishing out part and the overfishing and the nightmare of it is present also. But it's the other thing, the archaic. I'm really glad you're looking at the Mediterranean, because that's like one hell of the bottom of the Mediterranean is one of those places on the planet that so laden with history, and currently, I mean, hundreds of thousands of bodies in there. It's very interesting. Anyway, I'd love to see the Spirit film when you make it. Would very much.
So artists can talk all night, but deans have to go to bed early. So I'm going to call this to a close, but thank you all so much, and let's thank our guests.